It started with my project Make Thrift Mend, which started in 2013. And for a year, I wasn't going to buy any new clothing, but instead I was going to focus on making simple garments and buying secondhand and mending what I already owned. And I was just going to do that for a year to sort of give me a pause from fast fashion. And then that was 9 years ago, and I never went back. So I really focused on the thrifting part and the mending part. I do still make some garments, sewn garments, machine sewn garments, and I've taught myself simple knitting, very simple knitting. But the secondhand garments and accessories and then mending what I own really is, I think, become the bulk of the practice for me. So the mending, I sort of think of in this category of redesign. So that's redesigning through mending, patching and stitching, and also through patchwork, so cutting up fabrics and, reassembling them, and also through natural dyes. So that redesign category or that mending category, it might be mending something that's stained by dyeing it or faded or discolored, or it might just be sort of like reinvigorating that or redesigning that through color also. So most of my garments are secondhand, and a smaller portion is handmade, and then a larger portion is stitched or dyed or mended. And I think one thing that really shifted for me was thinking about the garment from the moment it enters my house and keeping it in with me for as long as I can, and then what would become of it once it inevitably leaves my house, even if that's a textile that's with me my whole life, right? At some point I will decay, and I'd like the fibers to decay with me. So by mending my own clothing, I started thinking about the fabrics that I was bringing into my wardrobe, and they were cottons and linens and silks and wools. I really like mid-weight fabrics, like mid-weight denims or mid-weight linens, because they're so much easier to stitch. And then also those cellulose and protein fibers could be dyed with plants. So it was really this sort of, it was like this little cyclone that kind of happened, looking to reduce the waste by mending and just increasing their longevity. But then that also put this pressure on the quality of what I was bringing in, because I wanted to enjoy mending it and feel like it was mendable, right, in terms of like the type of fabrics and how those would hold up to the stitching and dyeing too.
So I think you've explained your motivations there in terms of what you do. What does it bring to you in terms of emotional well-being, being more engaged with your wardrobe?
Yeah, I think, I have a background as an artist and a writer. And so for me, there's this chance for aesthetic and this chance for expression through the handwork. Sorry, there's a siren. And so I think that was always like this opportunity for creativity that is emotionally fulfilling and satisfying, and that also lets me think of the work I'm doing now as part of the trajectory of the work that I've been doing for 20 years, right? Starting with sustainability, moving into arts and arts community, and then moving into this moment of sustainable fashion, slow fashion, that then I can sort of see myself like threaded, if you will, right through that practice. So that's satisfying on a personal level. And then it's also just satisfying to be able to fix the thing. There's a sense of resourcefulness and resilience. And there's also this like reclaiming of the garment, inserting myself into the design process. If it's a factory made garment, right, then I enter into this conversation with the designer in terms of how I'm going to repair the thing or fix the thing. And it's also, particularly with the handwork, the stitching, or even the dyeing, it's quiet. It's quiet work. It's very forgiving. It can be interrupted. My kids can run in, I can set it down. And so that brings a sense of ease that I don't always feel with like machine construction or something like that.
And what other sort of social or cultural benefits might come from being more engaged, do you find? And are you noticing a movement more amongst people to want to be more involved with their clothes?
I think before the pandemic, the social side was stronger for me than it is now, because I would teach, workshops and host events and sort of gather with other artists in person fairly regularly. And so it had that like a quilting bee, right, or like a stitching circle. It just kind of had this social aspect to it. that has been different since the pandemic. And some of that has gone virtual and is online, and some of it's just gone away. So I think there is this sense of feeling tied to a greater community and an international community through the stitching and the dyeing, the sewing, thinking about sustainability and thinking about ethics in terms of the creation of the work. So I think that's nice to feel tied to that larger international community. And then also, folks regionally, fiber artists regionally that I feel connected with through that work. But it felt easier to create community before the pandemic, right? And to welcome people into my space or to make new connections to teach. So it is still nice to feel connected to something digitally, right? But I think there's less of a social component for me since the pandemic in the work.
And from the perspective of textile waste, how do you feel people becoming more engaged with their clothes by being more hands-on? How is that going to help conquer the problem that we've got of excess?
Well, I think about value, and I think about the more we understand value and can define value for ourselves, I think we're less likely to discard an item that we think has value. And so maybe that has value because it was very expensive. Maybe that has value because we made it and there's many hours of labor in it. Maybe that has value because it's my great-grandmother's quilt and it can't be replaced, right? Maybe that has value because I bought it when I was living in London as a college student, right? Like, I think there's lots of reasons, sentimentality, scarcity of resources, expense, like there's many ways we attach value. But I think when we do attach value to an item, we're less likely to discard it. So if you're making your own clothing or you're mending your own clothing, then you have the value of your own time and you have the value of the hours you've invested into it. So I think we're less likely to just get rid of it or to donate it when we're done with it, because we understand the labor and the skill and all the steps that it took to make it. So I think in that way it absolutely reduces waste because we're just more connected to it. And then I think, there's just the technical side of like enhancing or prolonging the life of the garment because I've mended it, right? So the knee tears and I put a patch on it, then the patch tears and I put another patch on it. And so through that process, the garment stays with me for a decade or 7 decades or whatever because I'm invested in repairing it.
What about the lack of skills that some people have? Is that a real limitation, and do you feel there's any answer to that?
Yeah, I do think that's a limitation. I mean, I think the resources of time and money and skill are always going to be a factor. So I'm always a fan of like the more solutions for the more people, right? And the more, if there's 12 people and they come up with 12 solutions, then that's great, because then those 12 solutions can be shared with 10 other people. Now we have 120 people, right? Whereas if there's one person with one solution, that might only get to 10 people, and that's 110 people that we've left out. So I think the more ways in which we can look at these solutions, the better. So for some folks, they're going to have more time, and they might have more time and less money, or they might have less money, or they might have more money and less time. And then I think craftsmanship is such a complicated thing because the work that I do is not very technically challenging. I mean, stitching with a needle and thread, it's very low entry in terms of materials, right? It's a couple of dollars for the thread, it's a couple of dollars for the needle. It's a lot of time. Like, that's the investment, is the time. And even simple techniques can get more beautiful, more complicated the longer you practice them and the more familiar you get with them. But one thing I love about teaching mending is even someone who's like really hesitant to stitch their own clothing, with 3 stitches and 2 knots, I can give them multiple ways to repair their clothes. And I think that there need to be more opportunities for folks to learn, and I think there need to be more solutions. Maybe you don't want to mend your own clothes, but maybe there's a local mender, right? Like a local tailor that you could go to and you could pay them to do it. Or maybe some of these fashion brands will start providing mending services. You could drop things off and have them mended. Again, I just think like the more expansive we can be in that thinking, then the bigger problem we can tackle.